Hey there, it's Steve from Serious Keto, and in this video we are going to revisit the 90-second Keto Tortilla. I rarely do back-to-back cooking videos on the same topic, but despite the fact that when I was working on the 90-second tortilla, I did 20 different variations on the recipe, and I also answered a lot. I think at least a dozen different anticipated future questions that you might have about substitutions. Still, there were more questions, and I'm going to cover those today, and we're going to try out some different variations on the 90-second tortilla. Now, first off, this is a microwave recipe. If you are anti-microwave, that's fine. We're all adults here. We can use whatever appliances we want, but we are using a microwave in this video. If that bothers you, probably just stop watching. You may, though, want to check out a video I'll link to down in the description below by Dr. Berg, Eric Berg. I know a number of people are fans of his. Check it out on microwaves. Perhaps that'll assuage some of your concerns. The most common question that I got on the video last week was, could you use parchment paper or waxed paper so you don't have to deal with using a spatula to get the tortilla off a plate? I tried that using one of these parchment rounds that I use on my tortilla press. The results were not good. It didn't cook well, it tore, it stuck to the paper. Overall, pretty epic fail. So right now we'll try it out with a parchment circle, or facsimile of a circle that I made by cutting out some thicker parchment paper. Now for this recipe, we are just going to make the original 90-second tortilla. All the ones that I do after this are going to be variations on that recipe. Now to make transportation of this parchment easier, I'm going to grab out the glass turntable plate from the microwave and use that as my transport mechanism. Start with 1 egg, ideally room temperature. This does make a difference in terms of how thick your tortilla is. A cold egg will result in a thicker tortilla. Whisk this up with my pogo whisk. Incidentally, I may have found a source to get these way cheaper. If so, I will link to it down in the description below. 1 tablespoon almond flour. 1 tablespoon whole psyllium husk. 1 tablespoon unflavored whey protein isolate. 1 tablespoon heavy whipping cream. Whisk until smooth. Scrape down the sides if necessary. And 1 final whisk. Kind of tilt this around until I get about a 7-inch tortilla. And then into the microwave for 90 seconds. And here is our parchment tortilla. A couple things you'll notice. We got some creases in it. I think we'll see why in a second when we lift up the parchment, but you can also see all of this moisture, this water that is condensed here. Look at this. Yeah, it like pours off. We got some water here. I have to wipe this down before I use it again. Yep. You can see the various creases on the parchment and how they impacted our tortilla. On the whole, I'm going to say parchment paper, not a great method, but I do have a great method. These are 9-inch silicone baking rounds for cakes, and these work spectacularly for these tortillas. In fact, this is all I'm going to be using from now on and what I'm going to be using for the rest of this video. If you plan on making these tortillas, and you should, I strongly recommend getting some of these silicone rounds, and I will include a link to them down in the description below. From this point on in the video, it's going to be all about substitutions. So I recognize that some people have dietary restrictions, some people have allergies, some people are trying to eke out every last carb they can on any given day and may want to try and reduce the carbs in this. Some people need to be dairy-free. I'm going to cover as much of that as I possibly can and show probably 3 more examples. We're going to go ingredient by ingredient, starting with the almond flour. The first test I did was I tried using my ultra-fine homemade almond flour that I made as a byproduct of making almond milk. And I'll link to that video up there in case you're curious about how to do that. The good news is you probably don't need to do that because the resulting tortillas were really kind of dry. I think the process of making the almond milk and then dehydrating the pulp really left me with mostly fiber and not a lot of the fat that helps add moisture to these tortillas. So don't worry about making your own almond flour. Coconut flour did work well using a teaspoon rather than a tablespoon. So the regular recipe calls for a tablespoon of almond flour. 1 teaspoon of coconut flour works just fine. I don't think I really tasted the coconut. So if you've got a nut allergy, that is an alternative. I mentioned in the previous video that I had tried out the lupini flour from Aviate, and that worked really well. Now, some lupini flours do have a little bit of an earthy taste, even Aviate, which has the least of the earthy tastes. A little pinch of any seasoning seems to cover that up pretty well. So if you plan on serving this with like an Indian dish, maybe you use a little pinch of garam masala. If you're doing this as a Mexican tortilla, maybe a little pinch of taco seasoning. But play around, have some fun with that. If you're less concerned about carbs, you could look at chickpea flour. Although I haven't used it, I don't see why that wouldn't work. Lastly, and just for grins, I tried using Carbolose. Not Carb Quick, but Carbolose. Carb Quick is even a little bit more sketchy in terms of the ingredients. Now, if you are clean, super clean, keto, you probably don't have Carbolose in your house anyway, so it doesn't matter. But if you do have some and you're curious, does it work in this recipe? Yes, it does. However, I would use only a half tablespoon in place of the almond flour. If you are looking to cut the carbs down to practically zero in this recipe, one of the substitutions that you can make is to use pork rind panko. Now you can buy pork rind panko out on Amazon, or you can make your own just by grinding up a bag or two of pork rinds in a food processor. I show how to do this in my carnivore tortilla recipe, which I will link to right up here. But rather than talk about it, let's just make one. We'll start once again with our 1 whisked egg, and then we're going to add our pork panko. Sometimes I call it pig flour. I found that a full tablespoon was a little too dense, so we're just going to go with 2 teaspoons. This is actually a spicy seasoned pork panko. Our tablespoon of psyllium husk, our tablespoon of whey protein isolate, our tablespoon of heavy whipping cream, whisk, scrape on the sides, final whisk, and onto our silicone mat. Give it a tilt to spread it out, and off to the microwave. Here we go. You'll notice none of that condensation here on my microwave tray. As for the tortilla itself, peels right off. So wonderful. I'm embarrassed that I used a plate before, but I'm going to move this off to a cooling rack because it's still pretty hot on my hand. The next ingredient that you might be curious about subbing out is the whole psyllium husk. A number of people have asked, can I use psyllium husk powder? Yes, you can. However, you really need to dial it back, like 1 teaspoon of psyllium husk powder rather than a tablespoon of whole psyllium husk. Now, then to balance out that, you may need to increase your almond flour a bit. I would start with a half a tablespoon, so take your overall almond flour up to 1.5 tablespoons. See how the consistency works for you on that. As I mentioned in the last video, another substitution that you can make for the psyllium husk is vital wheat gluten, but only use 1/2 tablespoon. One other thing that I tried, and it worked out absolutely abysmally, was substituting in oat fiber for the psyllium husk. That did not work out at all. It cooked up really, really poorly. There were places where it seemed almost overdone. There were places where it was still battery. It fell apart, and it tasted kind of gross. So don't use oat fiber. In terms of substitutions for the whey protein isolate, there are a couple that I tried. I tried heavy cream powder, and I believe the brand I used was Hoosier Hill Farms. Whatever it is, I will link to it down in the description below. I've had some viewers tell me that they've tried the Anthony's brand and did not care for that. But Hoosier Hill Farms, perfect substitution, 1 for 1, 1 tablespoon, you're good to go. It will add about a carb to the overall recipe. But now I'm going to try out 2 different substitutions that I haven't tried yet. One is pea protein, and that will have 0 carb impact on this recipe. If anything, it might decrease it ever so slightly. The other is a suggestion that came from one of my viewers, Red Hat Pat, to use the oat fiber as a replacement for the whey instead of replacement for the psyllium husk. So we'll give that a try and see how that turns out. First up, we will do the pea protein substitution. All the other ingredients will be the same, starting with our 1 beaten egg, 1 tablespoon of almond flour, 1 tablespoon of psyllium husk, and then 1 tablespoon of pea protein. Finally, our 1 tablespoon of heavy whipping cream. We'll do our whisk, scrape, whisk onto our silicone round. Tilt it around. Now this does seem a little thicker, so once we do the taste test, we may have to adjust down on the amount of pea protein that we use. And off to the microwave. And here is our pea protein tortilla. Again, peels right off, fairly pliable, liking the texture. We'll see how it tastes. For our final tortilla, all the same ingredients. 1 egg, 1 tablespoon of almond flour, 1 tablespoon whole psyllium husk. In place of the whey protein, we have 1 tablespoon of oat fiber and our 1 tablespoon of heavy whipping cream. Do our usual whisk, scrape, whisk onto our silicone round. All right, this batter is very thick. I'm thinking if this tastes all right, we're probably going to want to dial back to maybe as little as a teaspoon of the fiber. Yeah, it is so thick, it's actually sliding along the silicone here. Well, let's see what happens. And here is the oat fiber tortilla. This is definitely thicker. You know, I'm going to try this recipe one more time and do 1 teaspoon instead of 1 tablespoon. All right, here we go. 1 teaspoon instead of 1 tablespoon. Give it a little rotation and off to the microwave. Here we go. Oh yeah, this looks far better. So now we need to do a taste test. For the taste test on each of the tortillas, I'll be cutting off just a little strip so that I can leave the tortilla mostly intact for future use. Starting with the pork rind tortilla. This is very pliable. It tastes like what it is, a tortilla made from pork rinds. I will say that it is a little bit less moist than the standard recipe. So perhaps instead of 2 teaspoons, use 1/2 tablespoon. This is the tortilla where we subbed out the whey protein and used pea protein instead. Again, pliable, very firm. Oh, I tore off a little chunk. The taste is fine on that. Again, slightly less moist than the original recipe. I may consider dialing back to either 2 teaspoons of pea protein or 1/2 tablespoon. Next, we have the tortilla where I replaced the whey with oat fiber, 1 tablespoon. This is very thick. I'm somewhat nervous. Okay. This is the first one that gets thrown away right here. Oh, that was a rough one. Here we have the one where I used only 1 teaspoon rather than 1 tablespoon, and this one is looking far more normal. That works. The last substitute question that I've been asked is, could you make this completely dairy-free by eliminating the whey, which we did, and by replacing the heavy whipping cream? If you want to replace the heavy whipping cream, I have not tried either of these 2 options, but I would think they both would work. The first would be to use full-fat canned coconut milk. I think that would work. You could also try some other form of nut milk, but you may need to up your flour content just to balance that out since it's not quite as thick. I will include down in the description a list of all of the substitutions and what I found were the best quantities. If it's not in that list, I haven't tried it. If you want to try a substitution or an add-in or tweak this recipe at all, feel free. And feel free to let me know what your results are down in the comment section below. Now that you know all the different substitutions, you can really mix and match to create your ideal tortilla. Now last week I kind of poo-pooed the idea of doing this in batch just because in my mind this recipe was about making a single tortilla quickly. If you want to make these in bulk, you absolutely can. Just multiply out the recipe times the quantity of 7-inch tortillas that you'd like to make. What you will use per serving is a little bit less than 1/3 of a cup. I would say if I were going to do that in metric, probably around 70, 75 mil. But I think that covers all the questions from last week. I now have about 30 tortillas in my fridge, so I'm done making tortillas for a while. But by all means, you guys experiment. Have some fun with this recipe. I kind of look at this as like the chaffle of tortillas. You can experiment, try whatever you want, have fun. Thanks for watching.